For 6 long years, Laura had held onto her secret as if her entire world depended on it. And maybe it did. She told herself again and again that the past was buried, locked away so deep it could never claw its way back into the life she'd built. But life has a way of catching up to you when you least expect it. For Laura, it took only a single moment. One careless second for the walls she'd so carefully constructed to collapse. It was supposed to be just another day, another shift at the Grand Hotel where she worked so hard to remain invisible. But life had other plans. She hadn't intended to bring Emma with her. That morning, she'd begged the babysitter not to cancel, pleaded over the phone for any kind of solution, but there was none. It was a simple fact, she couldn't miss her shift, and that left her with no choice. She would have to take her daughter along and pray no one would notice. As she walked into the gleaming lobby of the hotel, hand gripping Emma's tightly, she repeated the instructions one more time in a hushed tone. "Stay close to me, sweetheart. No wandering, and whatever you do, don't talk to anyone." Emma nodded solemnly, her bright green eyes wide with a mixture of nervousness and wonder. Laura kept her head down, moving quickly toward the staff entrance as she had done countless times before. But this time, everything was different. Emma's small fingers clung to hers as they passed under the massive crystal chandeliers. The marble floors gleamed beneath their feet. Men and women in suits and evening gowns glided through the lobby as if they floated, their conversations soft and full of ease. To Emma, it must have looked like something out of a storybook. To Laura, it was a minefield. She was almost there. Just a few more steps, and they'd disappear into the service corridors, where no one would see them. But then Emma's grip loosened. Laura felt her hand slip free a heartbeat too late. She turned, panic already rising in her throat. "Emma," she called, her voice sharp and cracking. But Emma was already moving, her small figure darting through the crowd with a speed that didn't seem possible for someone so little. Laura pushed forward, weaving between people, barely able to catch sight of the pink ribbon in Emma's hair as she rushed toward something. Or someone. And then she stopped, right at the feet of a man who stood with his back to Laura. His tall frame dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit. Laura froze. Her blood turned to ice. Because before she even saw his face, she knew. Julian Carter. He was standing there as if he belonged to the room, the world revolving around him without question. She could see the way people looked at him, the way his presence commanded the space without him needing to say a word. And then Emma reached him. Without hesitation, without a second thought, she wrapped her arms around his leg, and held on as if she'd found something she'd been searching for her whole life. Laura's chest constricted so tightly she could barely breathe. Julian's head turned slowly, his sharp green eyes glancing down with mild annoyance. But then they shifted, confusion, disbelief. He was looking at Emma. Laura willed herself to move, to run, to pull Emma away before it was too late. But it already was. Because in the next moment, Emma lifted her face to his and spoke the word that shattered everything. "Daddy." The entire world seemed to freeze. Conversation stopped. Movement stilled. Laura's legs trembled as she tried to force them to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Julian's gaze snapped up, scanning the room, locking on her. His expression, once cold and distant, flickered with recognition. And something else. Something far more dangerous. Laura's instincts screamed at her to grab Emma and run, but it was too late for that. Julian was already kneeling, his large hands carefully peeling Emma's arms from his leg. His movements were gentle, but his focus was absolute. He studied Emma's face as if he were seeing something impossible. His eyes traveled over her dark brown hair, her striking green eyes. Reflections of his own, the same shape of her jaw, the same sharpness in her cheekbones. "Who told you to say that?" he asked, his voice low and quiet, but it carried through the air like a blade. Emma tilted her head, confused by the question. "Nobody," she said simply. Julian's brow furrowed. "Then why did you call me that?" Emma blinked at him, as if the answer was obvious. "Because you're my daddy." Laura finally reached them, her pulse thundering in her ears. She bent down, pulling Emma back by the shoulders, desperate to end this before it got worse. "Sweetheart," she said through a tight smile. "Come with me now." Emma frowned, unsure if she had done something wrong. "But it's okay." Laura cut her off gently, her voice quivering despite her best efforts. She stood, intending to walk away, to escape. But Julian was already rising to his full height. And there was no getting past him. He stood directly in front of her now, his presence as overwhelming as it had always been. His eyes pinned her in place, sharp and calculating. "Laura," he said, his voice edged with steel. "What the hell is going on?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay steady. "It's nothing. She's confused." Julian gave a humorless laugh, shaking his head slowly. "She's not confused." His gaze flickered down to Emma, then back to Laura. "She looks certain." Laura's breath came shallow, panic rising higher. She had to get out of here. She had to get Emma away. But as she took a step back, Julian's words came like a gunshot. "Is she mine?" The question hung between them like a live wire. And for a split second, Laura considered lying. She thought about denying it, pretending this wasn't happening. But there was no hiding from Julian, not anymore. Not with Emma standing there. Not with those green eyes staring back at him. Her fingers tightened around Emma's hand as she whispered, "Let us go." Julian's jaw clenched. "Answer me." Emma tugged gently at Laura's hand, confused, sensing something wrong but not understanding what. Laura's throat felt tight. She closed her eyes for half a second, bracing herself for what came next. Then she looked up at him, her gaze steady even as her heart fractured. "Yes," she said, and the word fell heavy in the silence between them. Julian didn't move at first. He didn't even blink. He stood there, the weight of her answer settling over him, sinking deep. His breath was slow and measured, but Laura could see the tension in his shoulders, the storm behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, deadly calm. "We're not done here." And Laura knew, without a shred of doubt, that everything she had tried to avoid was now impossible to escape. Laura's fingers ached from how tightly she gripped Emma's hand as they left the hotel. She didn't dare look back, though she could feel his eyes on them the entire way out. It was like walking through water, every step heavier than the last, every breath harder to take. Emma kept looking up at her, the silent question in her young, innocent face. Had she done something wrong? Laura couldn't bring herself to answer, not yet. Not until she figured out how to make sense of the disaster that had just unfolded in front of her. They stepped out into the cool evening air. For a brief second, Laura closed her eyes and let the chill sting her face, forcing herself to stay grounded. But her mind kept racing, twisting through years of carefully made decisions and sacrifices. She had spent 6 years constructing a life that kept them safe, far from Julian Carter and the chaos that always seemed to orbit him, and in less than 5 minutes, it had all unraveled. Emma tugged gently at her hand. "Mommy, is he really my daddy?" The question nearly buckled Laura's knees. She stopped walking and knelt in front of her daughter, brushing a stray curl behind Emma's ear. "Yes," she said softly, her voice barely holding together. "But we'll talk more about it later, okay? Right now, let's get home." Emma nodded, her trust absolute, and that trust made Laura's heart break all over again. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready for Julian to be back in their lives, for him to step into the world she had worked so hard to keep simple and safe. That night, Laura lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Emma had fallen asleep almost immediately, her small body curled up under the covers, unaware of the storm that was coming. Laura, though, couldn't close her eyes without seeing Julian's face. Those green eyes, sharp as ever, filled with shock, confusion, and something else. Something that made her stomach twist. She had known this moment would come. She had always known, deep down, that secrets don't stay buried forever. But she'd convinced herself she had more time, that she could delay this reckoning for just a little longer. And now tomorrow loomed in front of her like a wave she couldn't outrun. She had agreed to meet him at the cafe on 5th and Madison. Neutral ground. Public. A place where neither of them could lose control. But she knew Julian. He didn't need to raise his voice or make a scene to be dangerous. He didn't need to threaten her outright to leave her feeling cornered. His power was quieter than that, more precise. And she wasn't sure she could stand against him when it came to Emma. When morning came, Laura moved through her routine on autopilot. She got Emma ready for the day, packed her lunch, smiled when her daughter asked if they could go to the park later. She didn't let any of the fear show on her face. Emma deserved that much, at least until Laura figured out what was going to happen next. At 10 on the dot, Julian arrived at the cafe. Of course he did. He'd always been punctual. Back then, he used to say time was the only thing you couldn't get more of. He valued it, controlled it. Now, he walked toward her with that same calm confidence that had once drawn her in, and now made her skin prickle. He opened the door for her without a word and gestured for her to go inside. She hesitated for just a second before stepping in, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back as they crossed the threshold. She picked a table in the corner, away from the windows, away from anyone who might listen in. Julian took the seat across from her and didn't bother with small talk. His forearms rested on the table, his hands still as stone, and his eyes didn't leave hers. "Start talking," he said. Laura took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. "Where do you want me to start?" "You know exactly where." She looked away for a moment, gathering herself. When she finally spoke, the words felt like they'd been pulled from somewhere deep inside her. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after we broke up." Julian didn't react at first. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her, his jaw clenched so tight she thought he might break something. "And you didn't think to tell me?" "I didn't think you'd want to know," she said, forcing the words out even though they felt thin and weak in the air between them. His eyes flashed with something. Fury maybe, or disbelief. "You decided that for me," she nodded. "I did." His voice dropped, quieter but far more dangerous. "What?" Laura's throat tightened. She remembered the man he had been back then. Ruthless in business, cold in relationships. He'd told her once that emotions made you weak, that attachments slowed you down. He'd made it clear that his world didn't have room for anything that might compromise his ambitions. And back then, she'd believed him. "You made it clear what mattered to you," she said quietly. "You told me you didn't have time for distractions, that you didn't want anything getting in the way. And you thought a child would get in the way." He finished for her, his voice hardening. Laura nodded again. "I thought you wouldn't be the kind of father she deserved." He exhaled through his nose, his fingers curling slightly on the table. "And what if you were wrong?" The question caught her off guard. She had never let herself think about that. She had convinced herself that she'd made the right call, that she had spared Emma years of feeling like she wasn't important. But what if she had stolen something from both of them? What if she'd taken away Julian's chance to be someone different? "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I was wrong, but I did what I thought was best." But Julian stared at her for a long time, as if trying to figure out whether or not he believed her. "Well," he said finally, "no, I know, and I'm not walking away." Laura's chest tightened. "Julian." "No." He cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's my daughter, and I'm going to be in her life." Panic surged through her hot and fast. "You can't just decide that. "The hell I can't," he said. "You kept her from me for 6 years. You don't get to tell me I don't have a say anymore." His words were like a slap. For years, she had controlled this story. She had made the choices. She had believed she was protecting Emma. But now sitting across from Julian, she realized the truth. She had never really had control. She had just delayed the inevitable. Julian leaned in slightly, his green eyes sharp and unrelenting. "I'm not leaving this time." Laura wanted to believe him. Part of her even did. But another part, the part that still remembered who he had been, couldn't stop doubting. She needed to protect Emma. She needed to make sure this didn't end with her daughter getting hurt. "You can see her," Laura said slowly. "But it's on my terms. And if she gets hurt." "She won't," Julian said. "I'm not going anywhere." She studied him for a long moment, trying to figure out if he meant it. And for the first time, she thought maybe he did. But that didn't make it any easier. Laura walked out of the cafe with her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that everything in their lives had just changed forever. The next day felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, a place Laura had no map for. She'd agreed to let Julian meet Emma, and now there was no going back. She stood in front of the mirror, brushing Emma's hair, her fingers slower than usual, her mind elsewhere. Emma hummed a little tune under her breath, kicking her feet back and forth where she sat on the edge of the bed. She was completely unaware of the weight in the air. For her, it was just another day. She was going to meet her daddy again, and in her mind, it was simple. But for Laura, it was anything but. After all these years, Julian was suddenly here, and he was different from what she'd expected. He wasn't the cold, distant man she'd built up in her head. He wasn't the ruthless businessman who cared only for his empire, at least, not entirely. There was something else now. A steady presence, a quiet determination she hadn't anticipated, but Laura didn't trust easily, not with Emma. She couldn't. When they arrived at the park, Laura's heart was pounding harder than it should have been. Emma tugged her along the path, her little hand warm and trusting. The sky was pale blue, the air crisp. It should have been calming. But nothing could settle the storm in Laura's chest. And then he was there. Julian stood near a bench under the wide branches of a tree. He wore jeans and a sweater, casual and effortless, but he still looked out of place here, as if the normalcy didn't quite fit him. Yet when he saw them, his face softened in a way Laura hadn't thought possible. He crouched down before Emma even reached him, his tall frame folding down to meet her at eye level. "Hi, Emma," he said, his voice gentle. Emma's green eyes lit up. She didn't hesitate. She chirped, then added quickly, "Mommy said you want to see my drawings." "I do," Julian replied, and Laura could see the sincerity in his gaze. Emma pulled a notebook from the bag slung over her shoulder, and eagerly flipped through the pages until she found her favorite. She handed it to him, and Julian took it carefully, as if it were something delicate and precious. "You're very talented," he said after a moment, running his fingers over the colorful picture. "Your mom was right. You do have an artist's heart." Emma beamed, her pride glowing from every inch of her. "I'm going to draw space next. I want to be an astronaut." But Julian smiled faintly. "You'll be the best astronaut there ever was." Laura stood back watching, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. It was surreal, seeing them together. As if a piece of the world she had hidden away was unfolding in front of her without permission. She told herself to stay guarded, to remember why she had kept Emma away from him. But watching Julian with their daughter, she saw something different in his eyes. Not calculation. Not control. Just something etchingly human. They sat on a bench together, Emma chatting endlessly about stars and dinosaurs and her favorite colors. Julian listened. Really listened. And Laura felt something crack inside her chest. Later, as they walked home, Emma's hand was in Julian's now. She swung their arms back and forth, smiling. And Julian didn't pull away. He didn't stiffen. He matched her rhythm as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And for Emma, it was. Laura wanted to tell her to slow down. To be careful with her heart. But how do you tell a child to guard something that hasn't yet been broken? That night, Laura lay awake long after Emma had fallen asleep. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying everything she had seen at the park. Julian had surprised her. He'd been patient, attentive, present in a way she hadn't expected. But was it real? Or was it just something temporary? She wanted to believe him when he said he wasn't going anywhere. But she'd seen him walk away before. She wasn't sure she could survive watching him do it again. Not now. Not to Emma. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Julian came around more often. At first, it was just short visits, an hour here, an hour there. Emma showed him her drawings, her books, her favorite games. Julian listened, learned, asked questions. He didn't rush. He didn't push. Laura found herself watching him from a distance, waiting for cracks to appear in the calm exterior, but they didn't. One evening, he knocked on her door again. Laura opened it, surprised to see him holding a small bag in one hand. "She's not ready yet," Laura said, stepping aside. "I know," Julian replied, setting the bag down on the counter. "I brought something." Laura raised a brow as he unzipped the bag and pulled out a set of sketchbooks and colored pencils. "I thought she might want better supplies," he said, glancing at her. Laura swallowed the lump in her throat. "That's thoughtful." Julian gave her a small, almost wry smile. "I'm learning." She crossed her arms, unsure how to respond. These moments between them were strange. Suspended in something neither of them quite understood. They weren't friends. They weren't the people they used to be. But they were tied together by Emma, and that bond was undeniable. "Where are you taking her today?" Laura asked, her tone more cautious than she intended. "There's a museum downtown," Julian said. "They have an exhibit on space. I thought she'd like it." Laura nodded slowly, the tightness in her chest refusing to ease. "If she asks for me, I'll bring her home," Julian promised. Laura searched his face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt. But his gaze was steady. He meant it. When Emma came out of her room, dressed in her favorite T-shirt with stars on it, she was bouncing with excitement. "Daddy, are we?" Julian crouched down and smiled. "We are, ready to explore space." Emma nodded furiously. Laura knelt beside her daughter, brushing back a loose curl. "Be good, okay? And listen to your dad." Emma nodded again and threw her arms around Laura's neck. "I love you, Mommy." "Oh, I love you too." As Laura watched them leave, her heart ached. It was one thing to protect Emma by keeping her world small and simple. It was another to let her expand it, She didn't know which was harder. Hours passed. Laura checked her phone a dozen times, half expecting a call, half hoping for silence. Messages came through instead. A photo of Emma standing in front of a huge model of the solar system, smiling from ear to ear. A text that they were getting ice cream afterward. Simple updates. Normal. And yet Laura couldn't stop the gnawing feeling in her stomach. When they finally returned, Emma was glowing. She ran inside, waving a book about planets. "Mommy, Daddy got me this, and we saw the biggest meteorite ever." Laura smiled, hugging her tightly. "You sounds like you had fun." But Julian stood behind her in the doorway, watching them quietly. His expression was unreadable, but there was something softer in his eyes. "She did great," he said. Laura nodded, brushing a hand over Emma's hair. "Thank you for today." Julian's gaze stayed on her for a long moment. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." She wanted to believe him. She really did, but trust wasn't something she gave easily. Not anymore. As Julian left, Emma waved at him through the window. Laura watched the way he paused, smiled faintly, and waved back before walking away. And for the first time in years, she let herself imagine that maybe things could be different. Maybe they all had a chance at something new. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope, each step careful and deliberate, never knowing if the ground beneath would vanish without warning. Laura watched as Julian and Emma grew closer, as their moments together slowly began to weave something delicate but undeniable. Emma's laughter came easier now, filling the small apartment in ways it hadn't before. And Julian, he was there, really there, and it was that simple fact that left Laura more unsettled than she cared to admit. She told herself to stay guarded, that this was still new, that he was still proving himself. Yet every time she saw him kneel to Emma's height with quiet patience, or heard him listen as Emma explained the importance of coloring inside the lines, Laura felt the walls she had built begin to shift. He was different, not entirely, but different enough to make her wonder. One evening, they sat at the park again, Emma running ahead toward the swings as Laura sat on a bench, her arms crossed over her chest, eyes always tracking her daughter's every move. Julian sat beside her, silent for a long while, until his voice broke through the hum of distant traffic and laughing children. "She looks like you," he said. Laura glanced at him, startled by the softness in his tone. "Most people say she looks like you." Julian's mouth curved in something close to a smile. "The eyes, maybe, but the rest of her, it's you." Laura didn't answer. Compliments from him still felt like walking barefoot across glass. Dangerous. Unfamiliar. "She's happy," he added, his gaze never leaving Emma. "You've done a good job." The words hit harder than she expected. Not because she didn't believe them. She had worked harder than she ever thought possible to make sure Emma was safe, loved, happy, but because hearing them from him felt like something she hadn't realized she needed. Validation. Not of her choices, but of her effort, of the life she had fought to build. "She deserves to be," Laura said, keeping her voice steady, "and she deserves consistency." Julian turned his head, his green eyes sharp again. "You think I can't give her that?" "I think," she said carefully, "that the man I knew 6 years ago couldn't." The quiet between them deepened. Julian's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He looked down at his hands, then back at Emma, as if the answer lay somewhere in the simplicity of her joy. "I made mistakes," he said at last. "I know that." Laura took a breath. This isn't about what I know. It's about what Emma knows. "And I need you to understand something, Julian. If you walk away again, it won't just be me you hurt this time." "I won't walk away," he said firmly. She studied his face for a long moment. There was no arrogance there, no slick charm or empty promises, just a man who looked like he was ready to fight for something other than his business for once. Laura stood up. "Come on," she said. "She'll want help on the monkey bars." And when he followed without hesitation, she felt something inside her shift again. Days turned to weeks. Emma grew more attached to him, and Laura saw the bond forming in small ways. How Emma insisted Julian tie her shoes because he did it the special way. How she drew pictures of them together and taped them on the fridge. How she asked if Daddy could come to her school play. And Laura kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. She found herself watching Julian when he thought she wasn't looking. The way he carried Emma on his shoulders like he had done it 100 times before. The way his hand always rested lightly on Emma's back when they crossed the street, protective, careful. And one night, when Emma fell asleep on the couch after they'd spent the evening building a cardboard rocket ship, Julian stayed longer than he needed to, tucking a blanket around her, brushing her curls back with a tenderness Laura wasn't sure she was ready to see. You could stay, Laura had said, surprising herself with the offer. But Julian only shook his head. I'll see her tomorrow. He left without saying anything more, and she found herself staring at the closed door long after he was gone. The next morning, Laura got a call from Emma's school, a class project, parent-child day, and they needed both parents to be there. She almost laughed. Almost. Life had a way of throwing things at her when she least expected it. Julian agreed without hesitation. I'll be there, he said. And he was. Early, even. Standing there in a casual shirt and jeans, his sleeves rolled up, looking completely out of place among the other parents but never flinching. He sat beside Emma at the tiny table, listening as she explained the art project they were supposed to work on together, a model of the solar system. Julian took it seriously, asking questions, letting Emma paint the planets while he carefully glued the orbits. Laura stood by the doorway watching them, feeling something unfamiliar curl in her chest. Not just relief, not just pride, hope. And hope was terrifying. On the walk home Emma held both their hands, swinging between them. We're a team now, she said brightly. Laura forced a smile. We are. But her eyes flicked to Julian, who met her gaze with something unreadable. We are, he echoed. That night, Laura found herself standing on her balcony, looking out over the city, the cold air biting at her skin. She heard the door open behind her, and turned to see Julian step out. Can't sleep, he asked. She shook her head. Too much on my mind. He didn't press her. Just stood there, close but not too close. They were silent for a long time. Finally Laura spoke. Why now? He glanced at her. Why what? Why are you here now? After everything. Julian was quiet for a moment, then said, I was wrong back then, about a lot of things. And you're just realizing that now. No, he admitted, but I didn't think I deserved a second chance. And now you do. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. No, I'm not going to waste it. Laura looked at him, searching for cracks in the certainty but found none. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared of Emma getting hurt. I am too, Julian said quietly. That's why I won't screw this up. Laura nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle into her bones. They stood there until the cold became too much, then went back inside. Later, when Julian said goodbye and Emma hugged him tightly at the door, Laura found herself watching his hands again. How they lingered at Emma's back, steady, protective, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe he might really stay. The future was still uncertain, but for now, it was enough. The days passed, and with each one, Laura felt her defenses weakening in ways she hadn't prepared for. Julian was there, consistent, present in Emma's life in a way that no one else had ever been. What unsettled her wasn't his presence, but the steadiness of it. How easily he slid into a routine that should have felt foreign to him. He showed up when he said he would, never late, never distracted. He remembered Emma's favorite snacks, sat through her endless stories about school, and listened as if nothing else in the world mattered. And somehow, that was more terrifying than the man he used to be. One afternoon, they sat together in Laura's living room, Emma sprawled on the carpet with crayons scattered around her. She was drawing again, humming to herself, her focus absolute. Julian watched her, his elbows on his knees, his attention fully on their daughter. Laura watched him just as closely, studying the quiet concentration on his face, the small smile that tugged at his mouth every time Emma said something funny without meaning to. It was unnerving. How natural this felt. You never thought I'd be here, Julian said suddenly, his voice low. Laura's stomach clenched. She wasn't sure if it was a question or a statement, maybe both. No, she admitted. He nodded as if he already knew the answer. I didn't think I would be either. Not then. She wanted to ask why now, to dig into his reasons again, but something about the way he was looking at Emma stopped her. She didn't want to ruin this moment with old wounds. Emma stood up suddenly, crossing the room with her latest drawing in hand. She climbed onto Julian's lap, holding the paper out for him. This one's us, she announced proudly. Julian took the paper gently. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. His throat moved as he swallowed. It's perfect, he said. Laura felt something twist deep inside her. She hadn't expected him to become this for Emma. She hadn't expected herself to hope. When Julian finally left that night, he paused at the door. She's incredible, he said quietly. Laura managed a small smile. She is. He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before he nodded and walked away. When the door closed behind him, Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't know what came next. But for the first time, she wasn't entirely afraid of finding out. It was raining the day Julian asked to take Emma on his own for the entire afternoon. Laura stood at the window, watching the streaks of water race down the glass, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she debated whether to say yes. It wasn't that she didn't trust him. At least, that was what she kept telling herself. It was that letting go, truly letting go, wasn't something she'd ever practiced. But when Julian looked at her that morning, standing in her doorway with Emma's raincoat in hand, waiting patiently for permission, something inside her shifted. She nodded, and just like that, Emma beamed, grabbed his hand, and they disappeared into the mist of a gray afternoon. Laura sat in the quiet, the apartment feeling too still without the sound of Emma's voice. It was disorienting. She cleaned up without thinking, straightened things that didn't need straightening, and checked the time more often than she should have. And then the phone buzzed, a photo. Emma and Julian sitting at a cafe window, hot chocolates in front of them. Emma was mid-laugh, her head tilted back, curls wild around her face. Julian wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at Emma like she was the only thing that mattered. Laura stared at the photo for a long time, feeling something warm settle where the fear had been. When they came back, Emma burst through the door, soaked and laughing, talking about puddles and ducks, and how Julian had let her jump in the biggest puddle, even though her boots got soaked. Julian followed behind, holding Emma's umbrella, and looking a little less composed than usual, but there was a lightness in his eyes that Laura hadn't seen before. Later that evening, when Emma had finally fallen asleep, Julian stood at the door again, ready to leave, but this time, Laura didn't step aside. She stood there, blocking the door for a moment, uncertain why. Stay for a little while, she heard herself say. Julian studied her, as if weighing whether this was a test or an invitation. He nodded slowly and set his jacket down. They sat together in the quiet, neither of them speaking for a while. It was peaceful in a way Laura hadn't expected, and when she finally looked at him, she saw the man he had become, not pert easy, but real. "I'm glad you came back," she said quietly. Julian's gaze softened. "I wish I'd come back sooner." Laura shook her head. "You came when you were ready, and maybe so did I." They sat in that fragile peace, knowing nothing was certain, but for once, neither of them needing it to be. And when Julian reached for her hand, Laura let him. Not because everything was fixed, but because it was finally beginning, and sometimes, that's all you need.